Hey there, it's Tim. You've come to the right place. Let's get the show festivities underway this week as we go back in time to a little Paul Harvey news and comment.
In the beginning, the game was played on a rectangular field with an upright post in each corner. The corner posts were the four bases. That was early baseball. Folks were laughing at New Yorkers back then in the 1840s because New Yorkers were playing baseball instead on an infield diamond, one which was incidentally the same size and the same shape as today's baseball diamond. So, the sportsmen of that seaboard city were baseball pioneers, and in many ways, the Brooklyn Excelsior's team made baseball history in the summer of 1860 by touring. They made the world's first baseball road trip, visiting Rochester, Albany, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, and throughout the tour they did not lose one game. Of course, there was no official baseball championship in those days, and yet the Brooklyn Excelsiors were unquestionably the best team in the country. And in general, the Brooklyn baseball teams of that era, and there were many of them, produced our nation's finest baseball players. As time passed, however, there arose one exception. A Brooklyn team that started strong in 1884, but after a few years more began to decline. And that wasn't the only problem the team had. They couldn't find a name, at least a name that would satisfy a majority of their intrepid fans. For a while, they were called the Bridegrooms. You know why? Because in 1889, during that one season alone, 6 of the players were married, so they called the team the Bridegrooms. Later, they became the Superbas, after a famous aerobatic troupe of the gay 90s. And yet, as one sports writer pointed out, a translation of the Superbas would be the Proud Ones. And the way that particular Brooklyn team was playing baseball at the time, the players had very little of which to be proud. So, this baseball team's quest for a name continued. Now, we were in Brooklyn. It's more than 100 years ago. One of the baseball teams there has not yet discovered a catchy name for itself. About this time, the greater New York City area was just getting accustomed to a new public transportation system, horse-drawn trolley cars. That's all right. Go ahead and get ahead of me if you think you can. You're entitled to that once in a while. But this system, horse-drawn trolley cars, by previous standards, was elaborate and complex. It was a real hazard for city pedestrians. It seems folks were always surprised by and jumping clear of those infernal trolleys. For those on foot, narrow escapes were an everyday occurrence. And yes, that is where it started. That is precisely how this Brooklyn baseball team got its name. The name eventually stuck, survived the decades, even after the whole team was transplanted to the United States West Coast. You see, New Yorkers in general were nicknamed something in particular after their trolley car system was established. And that nickname, quite naturally, was adopted by the Brooklyn baseball team. And that became a Los Angeles baseball team. But the title still lives on in memory of the days when the pedestrians of New York, were known as Trolley Dodgers. Now you know the rest of the story.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there, everybody. My name is Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available. As you know by now, hopefully, it's the little show that we do for each and every week focused on what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate you finding us and downloading us and putting us in your earbuds this week. And hopefully you're doing okay. And spring is starting to spring, shall we say, wherever you are listening to this week's proceedings. We're back into baseball, and yes, spring training is underway, so it's appropriate. And as we've talked about many times before, baseball certainly, because of its lengthy history in American sports, dating back all the way into certainly the late 1800s. But as we'll talk about this week with our guest, Tom Gilbert, even prior to that, baseball certainly slips very much into the, moldy oldie sometimes explorations that we do around here. I think a lot of us enjoy more of the sort of contemporary forgottenness of sports, the World Football League, for example. But, I am certainly intrigued, and I do my very best to kind of solicit stories that, despite perhaps their age, are more than worthwhile to kind of go back to and understand because of various things and issues and contributions, shall we say, especially those that not only are forgotten, but maybe just elude us or we've taken for granted. And I think this week is a tremendous example of that. Like I said, our guest is Tom Gilbert, and he has 2 books out, actually one that came out in 2020. And I kind of rebuffed his original entreaty back when this book came out, because I dismissed it for being too old and sort of hard to kind of grok and sort of truly relate to and understand. And as that book became a runaway hit, especially in baseball historian circles, I've come to realize that I missed that opportunity, and was reminded of that, not by Tom, because he's too noble a gentleman for that. But from my own investigation and recognizing that Tom has a new book coming out in a couple of weeks, it was the perfect excuse for me to reach out to him, apologize profusely, and try to get him on the show in earnest to talk about not only his new book, which we'll talk about, called Death in the Strike Zone, The Mystery of America's First Baseball Hero. We'll get to that in a second. But also the genesis of that story, which we did not get to explore back in 2020 when his first book came out, called How Baseball Happened: Outrageous Lies Exposed, The True Story Revealed. These are both great books, and I think you're going to enjoy this conversation, whether you're a baseball fan or not, because as Paul Harvey in his news and comment from back in the day kind of alludes to, baseball, in particular the borough of Brooklyn or the city of Brooklyn, depending on your historical perspective, was very much part of the fabric and fiber of Brooklyn's very early history, going way back even before, quote unquote, organized baseball came into play around the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, et cetera. Pick your point in time when it was professionalized, if you will, in earnest. Because before that period of time, a club known as the Brooklyn Excelsiors, actually officially known as the Excelsior of Brooklyn, was kind of putting together some of the very first vestiges of what we now know as baseball, even prior to what we think was sort of the beginnings in the, in that latter part of that decade. And a guy named Jim Creighton, who is the subject of that second book, who has been either overlooked or only recently rediscovered as the guy, as we'll talk about, who created the era of modern pitching, overhand pitching. We're going to talk about the Excelsior Baseball Club of Brooklyn that Jim Creighton played for. And as you know, Brooklyn's baseball history certainly went on afterwards, as you heard there, becoming ultimately what is now the Los Angeles Dodgers, but various steps and name changes in between. But way back when, Brooklyn was making baseball happen. And a guy named Jim Creighton was very much part of that. And as you'll hear in my conversation with Tom coming up, this was not so arguably the first American baseball player to truly become something of a national sensation. This was sort of at the beginning or at the edge of the beginnings of the Civil War. And this was when baseball certainly was evolutionary, was forming itself for sure. But modern pitching really has been almost undeniably traced back to the doings of this character, Jim Creighton, including things like the strike zone and overhand pitching, and even just a strange and odd place in baseball history as this Jim Creighton fatefully lost his life in a game after getting hit by a pitch 4 days after doing so in a baseball game, only at the age of 21. But as we'll discover in this discussion, this conversation. The story of Jim Creighton is a really intriguing one. His contributions to baseball are hard to ignore. We get into perhaps some of the discussion about why he's not already in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And we're going to talk about really not only him, but sort of these early decades, these very early decades of how baseball kind of congealed and started to kind of put itself into a form factor that is arguably still today recognized in the game that we know and love. So we're going to get to that in a second, but I just want to remind you that both of these books can be found wherever you get good books. You'll find convenient links to the books and our friends at Amazon, where we've got an affiliate relationship, and we get some shekels of affiliate love by you choosing to purchase that way. And again, the books are as follows: How Baseball Happened, Outrageous Lies Exposed, The True Story Revealed. That came out in 2020. The paperback version came out in, I think it was a couple of years after that. That's available now, as they say, wherever you get your good books. And the upcoming book comes out on March 24th. But as you know, the folks at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever you get these fine books, certainly pre-orders help the algorithm and help the authors get discovered and recommended. And that's Death in the Strike Zone, the mystery of America's first baseball hero. The story really of Jim Creighton and the Excelsior Brooklyn that we're going to be talking about. You can pre-order that now wherever you get good books, and again, through those links as well. But let us tease you more and hopefully get you encouraged to do one or both of those book purchases. By listening to this great conversation, I learned a whole lot, and I think you will too. Here's my conversation we had with Tom Gilbert a couple weeks back. Please, as always, enjoy. I think you had reached out to me a couple of years back when your, I don't know if it's your first book, but you're certainly your very well received book about how quote unquote baseball happened was coming out. And I kind of glanced away from it a bit because it felt like it was really early stuff. But the more I kind of looked into it, and now obviously you have a new book coming out, so it's perfect timing for me to say the mea culpa. We're certainly intrigued about baseball's sort of early history and stuff. So maybe give our audience a bit of some background on who you are and how you came to kind of focus on these early days, really early days, origin story of baseball. And we'll get into the meat and potatoes of both of your previous book and the one that's coming out soon.
Yeah, sure. I've always been interested in history, just by nature. And I think I kind of fell in love with baseball when I moved to New York when I was about 25. And I had played it in high school and as a kid and kind of drifted away. And I started going to a lot of games. And the more I learned about it and the more I was curious about the history of New York City and Brooklyn, those things sort of feed off each other, especially if you go back far enough, because the average fan, their historical memory doesn't go back very far. And, you often hear people talk about modern baseball as though it started in 1900. And for very young people, they get suspicious if you start talking about anything that happened before the 50s. So baseball fans, they're interested in history, but they tend to forget, they don't have their memory doesn't go all the way back to the beginning. And I think that's kind of a shame, because you can learn a lot about baseball, or really anything, by asking the question, where did it come from? And then added to that is the fact that baseball has a really weird relationship with its early history. It has made up stories and even told lies about it for all kinds of interesting reasons. And there's a whole world of baseball before Major League Baseball that no one remembers. And I would say the most important fact about it is not just that it happened, but professional baseball, Major League Baseball dates itself back to 1876 when the National League was founded. There was a professional league before that, which Major League Baseball decided isn't Major League, called the National Association. And professional baseball started around 1869 to 1871. And there, depending on how you define it, But the really forgotten fact is that baseball had become a national sport and had been 95% built as a modern sport before it went pro. And that's the thing that the average fan has no idea about. So if we got in the time machine and we went back to 1860, we would recognize it as baseball. There's some differences, but the sport had basically already happened, to use the phrase I used in my book. And I get turned on when I research something and I find out that what everyone thinks about it is wrong. That's the fun of history for me.
Well, as we learn in this silly little show, right? Baseball has got the longest arc, if you will, is probably more entwined in history, although maybe cricket could make a case, but and there's clearly the roots of other sports too. But baseball probably most uniformly and most, I guess, with most amount of attention, right? Has been sort of since the mid 1800s part of the literary fabric and history of this country, let alone as a sport, right? And
absolutely,
and the whole amateur sort of tributary to what became the earliest of professional sports leagues in this country, really, is quite still pockmarked by divots and inconsistencies and all kinds of stuff. And it seems like it's still relatively fertile ground for truly getting at to what happened in those decades, I guess, prior to the National League, quote unquote, being created. The National Association certainly be part of it, but why go so deeply back into it? What has not been? Where has this controversy come from? I mean, you're mentioning Major League Baseball and maybe the Baseball Hall of Fame, but why have certain entities maybe looked the other way when perhaps some maybe historical truths have been revealed?
That's a great question. And I would say the short answer is that Major League Baseball and professional baseball as a whole, they have their own interests. And it's a money-making operation, right? It's a sort of a cartel. And it feels like it owns the history of baseball and it owns the sport of baseball. And the irony is that baseball came up from the grassroots. And it came up as an amateur sport that in the beginning, nobody saw it as an entertainment business or as a way to make a living even. It was almost a patriotic cause in the beginning. It played into all kinds of issues of national identity and culture. People saw it as a way to unify the United States in the early 19th century when we needed unifying. And, that's not a totally obsolete idea. We're pretty politically divided and culturally divided right now. But if, I live in Brooklyn, if I go fishing in North Carolina, probably one of the easiest ways to talk to local people down there, who I know quite a few of, is to talk about sports. And football fans can talk to football fans in other parts of the country. We take it for granted because it's been around so long. We think it's just a natural part of any country's national identity, but it really isn't. Baseball came to be for reasons that didn't have a lot to do with sports as such. In the beginnings of things, when you know the beginning of something, you understand it better. So, what's interesting about the subject of my new book, Jim Creighton, is how incredibly important he was and how no one really knows who he is. And if you ask, it's a common thing to say that the most important people in baseball history are people who changed the game. And Babe Ruth is the first person that comes to mind because, right, he introduced the home run as an important tactic, and we're still playing home run baseball. So the idea that one person left this mark on the game is fascinating. To understand baseball, you have to understand what Babe Ruth did. But I'm arguing in this book that what Creighton did dwarfs what Babe Ruth did. The invention of pitching, which led to the strike zone. And that's one of a long list of really important innovations and firsts for this guy. So why do people not really remember the early history accurately, or in many cases don't even care? The Abner Doubleday story was made up by people who didn't believe it. It wasn't a mistake. It was a constructed, it was called a myth. It's really just a constructed fairy tale that served the interests of Major League Baseball. And, you could write a book about why they had to do that, but it has no relationship to the historical truth. And neither does most of what fans believe about, the other things fans actually take seriously about early baseball. So it's fertile ground, and I feel like, I love baseball. I want to understand it better, and you can't understand anything without understanding where it came from or how it came to be.
All right, let's put Jim Creighton in perspective before we kind of get into his short but influential life in this budding sport at the time. Take us back kind of to, I guess, what we would generally refer to baseball's amateur era, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where does the hardest sort of circle sort of really fill in? Is it 1850 something? Is there obviously you can go back to cricket and all this kind of stuff, but where do you kind of draw the bright line to begin with?
Yeah. So what happened was, the very quick version, baseball was a folk game, just like hopscotch or, almost any other sport. Some sports were invented. Most of them were just children's games that were around for centuries. America, and until the late 1850s, if you went to Philadelphia or Boston or Baltimore or any city on the East Coast, you would see kids playing different bat and ball games. You wouldn't recognize most of them because they're all dead. They're all extinct. The one that was played in Lower Manhattan is our game of baseball. And, that's a pretty interesting story, which is the one that I told in my last book, How Baseball Happened. You can trace it. You can't trace it all the way back to the beginning because it just disappears into the distant past of things that people don't write down, and nobody writes, covers children's games in newspapers, and you lose the trail when you go back far enough. But we know it existed. New Yorkers played something called baseball in the 18th century even. But you can actually trace it to a section of Lower Manhattan, which is kind of fascinating. And then other things start happening. So America comes to be, and there's two sort of big social movements that are sort of looking for a tool to unify the country in one case, and you journalists get on board with this. They feel like the country is 13 separate colonies that have nothing to do with each other. They need to be unified in every way, economically, culturally, physically. And that they see what happened in England with cricket, and they think sports would help. And the question for them is which sport? And you also have a public health movement, because weirdly enough, what Americans were known for until the middle 19th century was being very sedentary and having no interest in adult sports, kind of the opposite of what we're known for now. The English visitors to America always made fun of Americans, saying all we cared about was business and making money, and you couldn't get men to play a game. That was considered childish. Okay, so these forces kind of come together, and there's a period of searching for the sport that is going to serve these purposes. And because of the power of baseball and because of the New York being the center of publishing and other reasons, it becomes the New York game that becomes chosen. So like a lot of other institutions in early and mid 19th century New York, baseball clubs spring up, and they're self-constituted. So there's no leagues, there's no championships, there's just clubs. They're kind of like, you'd have to compare them to maybe country clubs almost. And the purpose of them is to play amongst their members. And this idea spreads and becomes more and more popular in New York. And similar things exist in Philadelphia and Boston. But what happened, what sort of pushes it forward is the rising city of Brooklyn across the East River from Manhattan, which is an independent city until 1898. So in the 1850s, Brooklynites start falling in love with the idea of let's beat the New Yorkers at their game. And that, it wasn't done intentionally, but it pulls in all this, it creates all this drama and excitement and rivalry. And sports is about rivalries. And this is the first inner city rivalry. And it pulls all this energy into the game, and clubs start getting formed, and it starts spreading, and then it starts spreading out from the New York area. And Creighton is pitching for a team called the Excelsiors. They are the first club founded in Brooklyn in 1854. The people that are running them are people that believe in spreading baseball and making it a national sport. That's their ambition. And one of the things that Creighton and the Excelsiors do in 1860 is they start taking long trips around the Eastern Seaboard. They go to upstate New York, they go to New England, they go to Baltimore and Philadelphia, and they're actually sort of missionaries spreading the New York game of baseball to these other places. And that's really what gets baseball going as a national sport. And it succeeded.
The original barnstormers, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, in my book, I say that, these are the first road trips. And when you think about it, a baseball schedule, a championship season is just a bunch of road trips. So all these things, when we talk about a home team and a visiting team, they're not often, even if the two teams are from the same community, there's a home and a visitors. That goes way back to the mid-19th century when people would pay literal physical visits to another club and play them. And everything starts changing when the rivalry brings public interest in. And you can actually, if you're reading the papers, that's how we see early baseball, is mostly through journalism. It's kind of amusing to see the bafflement that in the sports writers when more than a couple hundred people show up at a game. So you have to it's a feat of imagination to think of baseball at its highest competitive level and nobody's watching because no one cares. Sports writers are saying when this starts to change, it's because people in Brooklyn and Manhattan are getting into the rivalry. And suddenly there's several hundred people at a game. This all happens very quickly in the late 1850s. There's a few thousand people at a game. In 1858, 15,000 people show up at a game. But there's no ballparks, there's no facilities, there's no admission charged. The fans sort of crash the party. And Creighton's part of that too, because he becomes the first actual fan draw. He becomes the first star on a national level.
Why do you think it was becoming such an attraction, maybe explain the rivalry as to maybe what was generating the interest that people would spend their time and go watch other people play this game thing, which didn't seem to be part of the American culture at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost turn that question around because the reason it's fun to explain is that we take it for granted that there's such a thing as fans, right? We root for clubs and they represent us, but do they, right? The Jerry Seinfeld has this famous bit about how he loved this player when he played for the Jets, and when he went to the Philadelphia, he hated the guy. And he was saying, are we rooting for laundry? I think was the comic bit.
Exactly.
And there's something a little bit strange about rooting fan interest. It's just that we all grow up with it and we take it for granted. So when it first shows up, why it did, I mean, because there was a rivalry in every sense between these two cities, Brooklyn and New York. And that the whole country kind of fell in love with this rivalry at a certain point because sports was covered by weekly newspapers that were all published in New York, and they had a New York bias. And people all over the country are following Brooklyn versus New York for a couple of years. But the bafflement about why someone would care who won, I mean, you could be baffled today about it, why anyone cares whether the Yankees win or not, right? And we sort of root because it's a fun way to consume the game as entertainment. But what's interesting to me is that the sport itself never intentionally sold itself as entertainment. it was actually surprised and disturbed when people showed up.
Well,
So
look,
it's really something from outside the game.
yeah, no. We also learned though too. Why don't you describe a little bit about sort of the typical amateur player at this time, right? A
Right. They
lot
all
of
have jobs.
they all had jobs, but it also is it fair to say, I certainly know in the late 1800s by this time, but maybe not at the pure amateur level that we're talking about a couple of, a decade or two before, but maybe it was. I get the feeling, and I'm an amateur historian, right? I just play one on TV, so don't, but they're almost roguish kind of characters and with drinking and all that
Yeah,
kind
no,
of stuff,
really,
right? It wasn't a noble kind of
well,
pastime per se.
that's actually not true of the earliest period. That was true of the early professional period.
Interesting. Okay, that's why I'm getting at.
So money changes everything. So in the period what I'm talking about, so before 1869, up until that point, for about 12 years, baseball had a national governing body. This is all forgotten, but they had the equivalent of organized baseball, but it was called the National Association of Baseball Players.
And as an amateur sort of
This
rule
is all
making.
totally amateur, and it was founded in 1858, and it went out of existence around 1869-70. So they were in charge of baseball during this formative period when it went from a New York thing to a national thing. And you've probably heard of the Cincinnati Red Stockings that went undefeated over the 1869 season and crisscrossed the country by rail. That team is famous because Major League Baseball considers it the first professional team. They're that's the culmination of that era in a way. But money, these people were actually avowed amateurs, and the kind of people that had the leisure and the money to be able to devote themselves to a game that wasn't paying was a very narrow demographic. It was certain kinds of people that lived in cities that had time and money. And we have a lot more leisure than people did in 1850 and 60. So I call them, I borrowed a term from another historian, the sort of emerging urban bourgeoisie is the term, which is a pretty horrible phrase. But what they are is, when you get to know them, they're doctors and lawyers and businessmen, people that own companies, people that have some money and leisure. And they're sort of forward thinking, and they're interested in where the country's going and improving things. And they're involved in a variety of social movements, which is kind of interesting. A lot of them are involved in abolitionism. A lot of them are involved in railroads and telegraphs. And it's 100% amateur. And they actually have a rule that was introduced in 1859, which tells you that it was probably starting to become necessary, that you couldn't compensate or pay players if you were a club. And one of the fun things, of course, you can imagine when games start drawing fan interest and there's press coverage, which were all happening in this time. In 1858, Brooklyn challenged New York to a 2-out-of-3 all-star series of our best players against their best players. And they actually charged 10 cents admission almost by accident because they held the games at a racetrack and they wanted to have money to repair the damage to the grass. So they charged 10 cents and they were shocked when more than 10,000 people came to the first game. It was a phenomenon. And this sort of got the ball rolling. It made people realize you can make money off this thing. And then money changes everything in every possible way. So until real professionalism around 1869-70, there were sort of social standards for who could belong to these clubs. And all the great clubs of this time that I read about in my book, they were people that knew each other already before they started playing ball. They weren't baseball organizations exactly. A better analogy would be sort of a country club where, you play golf with your friends at the country club and maybe you have club on club tournaments, but that's sort of a special case. And maybe you have a ringer that you hire to be your golf pro, which things like that happen in baseball and cricket. But it was supposed to be amateur and it wanted to be amateur. And partly the reason was to sell it as a respectable thing to do.
Was there any
The sports-
cultural cachet to this? Not unlike a country club, or was that not the dynamic involved?
Well, yeah, and you may have heard of the New York Knickerbockers. It was one of the early New York clubs.
Well, which you famously in your book say got a little too much early official attention as maybe the first baseball game per se, right?
A lot of, even today, a lot of references will say this is the first baseball club, and that's not even close to being true. What it was it was important socially because these guys were mostly Wall Street guys. They were people that other people looked up to, and if you look at it from the point of view of the people that are trying to sell this New York game of baseball as a respectable thing to do in a Victorian period when all male activities are somewhat suspect. And if you talked about sports in 1840 or 1830 or 1820, it's not something women would be interested in. There's a lot of drinking, fighting, and gambling involved in all the sports that were participated in. Boxing, horse racing, bear baiting, shooting, all kinds of sports like that were things that young men did that weren't entirely respectable. And baseball had to be sold to the sort of puritanical middle classes. So the amateurism was part of keeping it respectable. And the whole thing changes when, under the pressure of competition, money comes into the game. And one of the questions about Creighton, there's several huge unanswered questions about him, including what he was doing on the mound. But one of the off-the-field questions is, was he paid? And it's a really interesting question.
All right. Well, let's back up and talk about this guy, Jim Creighton, who had a very short life, and there's a reason why we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But this, it seems to me like your upcoming book is almost a personification of this era, almost in him, because he's this guy who arguably is straddling this amateur tributary into whatever the professional thing is going to be. No?
Right. Yeah. And he's a big reason why professional baseball came to exist. It wasn't just what he was doing as a pitcher. It was the fact that he became a star. A few years after he died, a sporting goods company published a mounted picture of him on a card with some text on the back. And it's the first baseball card, and it's of him, and he's dead. I mean, his fame endured.
So let's describe him. What is his backstory, and how does he become, if you will, the chosen one? How does he become a star, or the first star, or getting attention in this game that you're saying is really a club versus club kind of amateur thing, and not really designed for audiences?
Right. Well, so he grew up in what's called the 5 Points section of Manhattan, which it was an infamous slum. When he grew up in it, was a poor and working class neighborhood. If you saw Gangs of New York, the film, that's where it's set. And Creighton was born in 1841, so before the action in that film. It wasn't an Irish neighborhood. It wasn't full of Irish immigrants when Creighton was born, but poor immigrants, mostly Irish and some Germans, came into Lower Manhattan in huge numbers in the second part of the 1840s into the 1850s. And Creighton, in baseball history terms, that's the Dark Ages. We know from all kinds of circumstantial evidence that baseball was played, and Creighton definitely would have grown up playing baseball as a kid. But we don't know. We have names of some clubs. We don't know who played them. We don't know who they were. It's because it wasn't covered in the papers and no one thought it was important. We know almost nothing about it. But the more you read about Creighton, the more you realize that he was a conspicuously great athlete. And he may have played cricket, he may have played other sports, because when he's 16, his family moves across the East River to Brooklyn into a house that there's no way they can afford. And I did a lot of research into how they got possession of this place, and there's a mountain of circumstantial evidence that the Excelsior's team, which was backed by some wealthy guys in Brooklyn Heights, which was sort of upper middle class suburb at the time, they bought the family a house to get Jim Creighton to move to join their club. And that might sound like a pretty ordinary thing to happen in the sports world, but he's the first youth athlete recruited by a team sport in American history that I can find, because such a thing was not done. And I think the reason was he was an outstanding athlete. He was great. And there's evidence for that. He becomes a dominant baseball player to a degree that's almost hard to wrap your mind around. But he actually took up cricket too. And in 1860, he started playing cricket. And Americans had a problem with cricket, which was they just couldn't compete with good English cricketers. It was too difficult. But Creighton became probably the best bowler in North America. And at this time, there's hundreds of cricket clubs, all made up of Englishmen. He became the best bowler in a matter of about 6 months. So it would be sort of like he's a Jim Thorpe or a Michael Jordan. You realize that everything he does, he's good at athletically. And somebody, we don't know the details, but somebody recruited him for the Excelsiors and brought him to Brooklyn. And interestingly enough, one of the things they lied about was when he moved to Brooklyn, because what they were doing, recruiting a guy like that who had nothing to do with their community or the other players in the club, was a bit possibly across the line in terms of amateurism.
Let's back up for a second and talk about the confluence between cricket at the time and this baseball thing at the time.
Yeah.
It's another straddle he's doing there, right? Which is even doubly interesting.
It's hard for people to believe this, but cricket was evolution, and in terms of its evolution toward a modern sport, was way ahead of baseball because it had already started happening in England. And America in 18, 20, 30, 40, 50 has a lot more immigrants from Great Britain than it does now as a percentage of the population. So there are people that grew up playing cricket all over the United States and Canada, and they're forming cricket clubs. And the journalists that were later on team baseball, they started out on team cricket, and they were trying to sell cricket to Americans. Of course, cricket had succeeded in many British colonies, right? But it had a hard time in America for reasons that I dealt with in my last book. And one of the problems was we couldn't compete with the English, and it really bugged us. In 1859, sort of an all-star team came from England, and Americans were hopeful that we would at least not embarrass ourselves against this club. And we were humiliated. So that was discouraging. So and it was around that year that people started giving up on American cricket. But if there were more Creightons, it might have been different, because Creighton was a cricket star almost instantly.
And weren't there a lot of cricket clubs though? I know in Philadelphia in particular.
Oh yeah, there were hundreds, many more than baseball. And yeah, Philadelphia was the center of American cricket. They did the best against the English, but they couldn't beat them. And for about a majority of early baseball players played cricket too, which is something that has been forgotten. But for reasons that my first book was about, and the Creighton book's really not about, although you could credit Creighton for some of it. Cricket didn't make it in America. It made it in other colonies that were different in different ways, but ultimately Americans wanted an American sport, is the bottom line.
And this is where it gets really intriguing, because as he's recruited, I guess, but I can't think of a better word, to Excelsior in Brooklyn,
Yeah.
He's bringing a bag of skills that sort of are at one level cricket-like, and other level, if you will, evolutionary baseball-like. And my guess is that this is where his inventiveness of getting the ball across changes and creates a panic, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about pitching, because a lot of historians have assumed what it sounded like you were about to say, that maybe he adapted some cricket technique to baseball, but in a funny way, it was the opposite. So the way pitching worked, and there's no strike zone in the 1850s, which sounds crazy, right? But the way baseball worked was the pitcher would run up to a line, and the line was 45 feet from home plate. and it's called pitching because he would, with a straight arm, dead underhand, you had to pitch the ball like you're pitching a horseshoe. And in cricket, also, you ran up and threw the ball. And
Right,
originally
try to get power
also.
behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is you're running up to get a little momentum, and then you're flipping it with your hand like the hand of a clock. There's no bending of the wrist or elbow, and you're pitching it forward. So the reason we call it pitching is that it goes all the way back to this technique, which was, one of the early baseball rules is the ball must be pitched and not thrown. So throwing meant whipping the arm and snapping the wrist. You couldn't do that. And in early cricket, cricket had gone off in its own direction, but in early cricket, they also ran up and threw the ball underhand. So Creighton, what he did was he, in cooperation with his catcher, who was a guy that was an early advocate of weight training and kind of on the cutting edge of physical training itself, an older man named Joe Leggett, they came up with a new way to pitch that's a lot more like modern pitching. It was underhand, but he didn't run. He took one stride. And we only have 2 photographs of him and some drawings, but you can deduce from them what he was doing. He figured out something counterintuitive, which you and I know, that the torque of uncoiling your hips and shoulders in coordination will put more on the ball than running forward. So like a baseball pitcher can throw the ball harder than a cricket bowler can now, because the cricket bowlers are running forward. And I don't want to get too technical, but you can't close your hips and uncoil, right? So Creighton figured, he took one stride, and he started by closing he was right-handed, his left leg, wrapping it around his right leg, closing his upper and lower body, and then whipping open. And he released the ball from way down low. And this was legal. That wasn't how anyone else had ever pitched, but it didn't violate any rules. But he got a lot more velocity on the ball.
Was it more sidearm than anything?
No, it was dead underhand. But maybe I'm not explaining it well, but it's hard for us to really wrap our minds around. But it's the energy comes out of the uncoiling of your hip followed by your shoulder, and this is the same way people throw now. The difference
versus the run-up velocity thing.
Yeah, where you have to keep your hips square to the batter because you're running forward, right? If you're running forward, you can't close your body and then open it. You'll fall down. The other thing that it facilitates is breaking pitches. So, all right, so just go back to the way pitching was. A pitcher who's running up to a line 45 feet away and pitching the ball like that, it would hard to imagine that he's breaking 50 miles an hour. So there are types of softball where people pitch like that. They don't throw very hard. And the whole skill of pitching was, there was no balls or strikes called. So the pitcher was sort of on his honor to put the ball where the batter could hit it. And the batter was on his honor to swing if he got a good pitch. And believe it or not, that worked. But what Creighton was doing was he was throwing the ball so fast and with so much movement and so much precision that it was almost unhittable for these hitters. But they couldn't use the excuse of, well, he's not throwing it over the plate, because he was. And this created a weird impasse. If you put yourself in the position of a batter who's used to having the ball flip toward him at 40, 50 miles an hour, and I have a whole chapter part of a chapter on how fast was Creighton throwing. And to speed to the answer, it was the equivalent of low hundreds now. So you're used to 40 or 50, and now you're getting 100. You're getting Aroldis Chapman.
Well, and you can imagine, I'm sure, the hemming and hawing that was going on, that was illegal and all that kind of stuff, right? People are just not only flabbergasted by the ability to do that, but probably challenging it from the minute that they saw that.
Yes, but after he threw, very true. After he threw a couple of pitches in his first outing in relief in July of 1859, the game stopped. And it's kind of maddening because the reporters covering it didn't really bother to ask anyone what was going on. They just said, "That's funny. There's a lot of important baseball people here. And then they said, well, after this guy Creighton came in, there's a conference going on with the umpire and the captains and other people, important baseball people. And then the game is allowed to continue. And, it's not hard to imagine that people said, what the hell is this? And it can't be legal. And it was decided that it was legal.
Who's deciding it was legal? Now,
well, the umpire was ruling that it was legal, but they actually
was the association though getting involved?
They had a rules committee, and they looked at it more than once, and they couldn't see a rules violation, and there wasn't one. In my book, I talk about the fact that later people decided there must have been one, and almost every history book now says that he was cheating. And I went into this book with an open mind about this, but I'm convinced he wasn't. I think people didn't understand it was the problem.
So part of this dynamic, though, so I want to get in his head for a second, right? Because this is, I guess, looking back, right, and now obvious, this was, is it fair to say this was injecting deception into the realm of delivering the ball versus maybe this, you said before, honor system or maybe gentleman's agreement as to getting the ball across so that it could be hit into play?
Exactly. I mean, all they had to work with before he came along was, I actually play in a softball league that's a little bit like this. All you got is you try to make the batter makes less than perfect contact. That's the best you can do. So if the guy likes it inside, you try to keep it outside, but you can't really work with it. You can't, you can't throw hard. You can't throw breaking pitches. There's a limit to what you can do. You just try to help the batters not hit the ball really, really hard. And and you can imagine what scores were like, because I didn't mention that players didn't have gloves either. So, 30-20 didn't open any eyes in terms of a big score. That was pretty ordinary. When there was a game in 1862, it was 7-4. That made headlines as the smallest score on record. So massive amounts of runs are scored. And that was the idea. That's how baseball worked. It was basically like some types of softball is the best way to think of it. Everyone's going to hit the ball hard, and which defense turns most of the hard hit balls into outs, they win. So yeah, Creighton he's a problem because he's putting the ball over the plate over and over and over again, and no one can hit it. He also, we know a little bit about how he got there. He wasn't a huge person physically, but his catcher had him throwing iron baseballs at a fence in his backyard.
So it was like a medicine ball sort of kind of dynamic.
Yeah. And people use weighted balls now, but no one did it then. No one did any kind of weightlifting. So he built up all this strength, and, I get into the weeds of how he threw a curveball without snapping his wrist, and it's all about finger strength, which you have to build up. And from a historical point of view, it's, your everything we know is through the eyes of reporters, most of whom don't know what they're looking at. So it's you have to sort of, I can sort of compare it to a cold case. It's an unsolved murder, and all I've got is files written by people who didn't solve the murder, and I'm trying to figure out what happened. But I feel like I did for the most part.
All right, before we get into his demise, I do want to get into a sense of like how. So more in sort of the how this thing is getting spread out into the ether, into the news, into the reportage. This new way of delivering the ball over the plate. Aside from those who kind of hemmed and hawed about it maybe being potentially illegal and all that kind of stuff, was there any immediate sort of movement to kind of replicate, and or was he creating any disciples?
No, he did. He did. There were a few people that figured out how to do what he was doing. The first, it was just wonderment. I mean, when he did these tours, you read the descriptions of people. They go to Baltimore and they play the club in Baltimore. It was recently founded, a New York style club, and they say they compared it to bullets, and they were saying that our guys started to swing, but the ball was already in the catcher's hands, and so what you have is just awe and shock.
Is he being promoted like that as the star attraction, so to speak?
Oh yeah, he's number one. He's the biggest star. Everyone wants to see Creighton. They want to see their guys try to hit him. The Baltimore game, the Excelsiors won 51-9, and the Baltimore journalists say, without trying to be funny, that they felt like the Brooklyn team held back so that they wouldn't embarrass them too bad. 51-9 wasn't running up the score. I mean, they were completely dominated. And there's great descriptions by people who played the bat and ball game that was played in Boston of seeing Creighton for the first time on Boston Common in 1862, demonstrating his pitching. And, one of the eyewitnesses who wrote about it became a pitcher and copied Creighton. And there were people
not easily copyable, though.
Not easily. No, there were only 3 or 4 people that really could do anything like what he was doing, within the next year or two. And the problem was that it sort of raised the bar for all pitchers. The only clubs that were competitive, I should rewind a little bit, but the way championships worked in this era when there's not schedules and there's not leagues is it was like boxing. You would challenge the champion. And if you beat him two out of 3 over the course of a season, you were the champion. That's the way it worked. So if the Brooklyn Excelsiors are champions and the Brooklyn, the New York Mutuals want to challenge them, they'll arrange for 3 games over the course of a summer. And if they win 2, they're the champion the following year. That's the way it worked. In order to contend for the championship for a while there, you had to have a guy who threw really hard and could do what Creighton was doing. And there were only a couple of those guys. There may be 15, 20 teams that were on that level, and there were 3 or 4 of these pitchers. Creighton dies in late 1862. It's not for some time after that there's more than a handful of guys that are doing what he's doing. And you have another problem, which is most pitchers couldn't do what he was doing. It was too physically difficult. And so what they did was they cheated. And that's actually the beginning of the modern way of throwing the curveball. They started disguising wrist snaps, and they started raising their arm angles and sort of fighting with the umpires about the legality of raising your arm angle. And that was sort of modern pitching kind of comes out of Creighton breaking all the rules and then other people cheating to keep up with him.
And it wasn't like he was teaching people how to do it either.
No, I mean, his catcher actually taught a few people. His catcher lived a lot longer than him. But Creighton died at 21. And I mean, I'm eternally fascinated by the fact that the people that were alive playing with him and hitting against him and watching him didn't really understand what he was doing.
So this is a guy who died when he was 21, right? So even then, that's still an early age. But I believe one of the threads here of this mystery of his death, and it clearly seems to be that it is still shrouded in mystery, and I'm sure you get to some of the answers, if not maybe the answer. But it seems to me like he's being used a lot, right? His success, right? I can't imagine they wouldn't want to have him pitching every game if possible, especially if they're touring and trying to get people to come see and pay some admission.
You're exactly right there. A pitcher is an everyday player in those days. And of course, that makes sense when they're not putting out much effort, like the traditional style of pitching didn't call for much effort. They didn't have pitching staffs. The team had a pitcher. In fact, the catchers would get replaced more often than the pitchers because they got hurt. It's trying to stop balls with no equipment. But what happened when Creighton comes along is, and it's totally easy to understand, if you and I were playing for the Brooklyn Atlantics and we're used to these 40, 50 mile an hour pitches coming in straight, and suddenly we're getting major league level stuff with breaking stuff, there's no strike zone. So your next move is pretty obvious. You don't swing, right? Why would you swing at something you can't hit? And no one's going to make you swing. The umpire doesn't call balls or strikes at all. So we don't have pitch counts for a lot of Creighton's games, but for some of them we do. And there's games where he literally threw 90 pitches in an inning, and not with more effort than the traditional pitcher used because of that torque that he used in his upper body, in his lower body. He was, they use the term max effort. He was the first guy who was a max effort pitcher. And imagine if you're facing, a great pitcher now or Pedro Martinez, and you don't have to swing. It doesn't work because no one's going to swing until he makes a mistake or gets tired. He threw 400 pitches in a game. And he physically began to break down. So we do understand what was happening to his body. That some of the questions are about how much people knew while it was going on.
Well, plus he was also batting too, right? So that's, it's a two-way. Yeah.
He was a two-way player, and he was a very good fielder and hitter too. But the workload is, I was trying to calculate it in modern terms because he's throwing so many more pitches an inning, and he's throwing with a lot of effort. I was estimating that he threw something like 160 innings in 1860. It's the equivalent in the majors of like 500 to 700 innings.
Were there certain batters just waiting him out because he pitches so much?
Absolutely. You read game descriptions where a guy takes 40 pitches and then swings at one. And of course, this is hard to watch too. It was a disaster from every point of view. And they had to start calling balls. And it was a slow process that took years, but because of what Creighton did, changing the balance between pitchers and hitters like that, and because baseball mattered more and there was money on the line, Creighton pushing baseball toward a strike zone. And it starts with balls being called in 1864, and then they start out, they'll warn you if you throw several bad pitches. It wasn't every pitch being called. And then they start introducing called strikes. And the strike zone is a direct result of what Creighton was doing. The problem is that Creighton was born with a thing called an inguinal hernia. I don't know if you know what that is. I actually have one.
I do not. Please explain.
It's an inherited weak spot in your lower abdominal wall. It's pretty common. And it doesn't kill anybody. It's a very easy thing to deal with now. Normally, it's just there. And if you're an athlete or you do something that it requires a lot of twisting or straining, or you lift a lot of weights, you can kind of create an opening in the muscle wall. And the bad scenario is if this happened to you today, it would be discovered very easily. And then it happens to athletes all the time. There's a simple operation to strengthen that area. You never have to worry about it again. The problem is there's no operation in 1862 that works. And if it gets wide enough, you can get a little bit of sort of intestinal tissue caught in there, which gets the blood supply cut off, and then you get gangrene. And we have after a lot of looking, people have found 2 death records for Creighton. Both of which say he died of a strangulated intestine, which is what it would have been called then. Now, the interesting thing for me is, so if you understand how this disease process works, it would have been a weakness that widened over time, over years. So, and the worst thing you could do for it is violent twisting and weightlifting, both of which is what he was doing.
Exacerbated by all these pitches and then the volume of
right. Then he's under this incredible workload. And, if you might be tempted to say, well, the team, it's a new style of pitching and baseball's changing. And how would the people running the Excelsiors know that they were endangering his life? Well, there's actually an answer to that question. A lot of them are doctors. And this was a very well understood condition. He probably wore some kind of truss. It would have been very common. The president of the Excelsiors is a medical doctor. And it's possible that was the guy that recruited Creighton in the first place, and he might have known him from treating him. But other people on the team were doctors. There were a lot of physicians on the Excelsiors, weirdly enough, including some of Creighton's close friends and teammates. These guys are getting dressed with him. They're watching him play every day. They know exactly what's going on with him. The catcher that's training him, it's hard to believe it was a secret that they were risking his health. I don't think they intentionally killed him or anything. But, another thing you can judge this question by is what they said after he died. They said things that make no sense. The Excelsior's didn't. The first stories were that something that happened in a game in October of 1862. Creighton was swinging a bat and he felt pain, and then he went home and died 4 days later. That's what the initial news story said. So we know from the medical facts of this that there's nothing. He didn't do anything swinging a bat. He might have felt uncomfortable after a swing, but this was basically a deteriorating condition over months or years. And then what did the Excelsiors say, including the president himself, who's a medical doctor? He said, we didn't kill Creighton. He was injured swinging a cricket bat in a cricket match a week earlier. And I find that kind of fascinating, because the one thing this guy would have known is that it had nothing to do with hitting, and it wasn't a traumatic injury, right? He didn't. If he was honest, he would have said something like, he had this condition. We did our best to protect him, but these things happen, or something like that. But instead, he tells this lie that it was from swinging a bat in a cricket game. And I think that shows some consciousness of guilt on their part. I think they knew they were risking his health, maybe not his life, but by overusing him, and they were doing it because he was so important. Right? That's not hard for baseball fans.
Years later, though, there was another wrinkle to the story, right? In that he was assumed to have injured himself hitting a home run, of all things.
Yeah, that was the story told by Jack Chapman, who was a contemporary. He was an outfielder for the Atlantics. He told the story in like 1911. And it's just one of those things that these stories are these events are too dramatic to leave alone for people.
Well, it certainly sounds a little more heroic or clean, so to speak, as a story.
Right. Well, the Chapman version has him swinging a bat, hitting a home run, and rupturing his spleen. Well, he didn't die of a ruptured spleen, so we know that's not true. If you ask a doctor, he'll tell you there's nothing you could do swinging a bat that would rupture your spleen. Right? You'd have to have a car accident or fall off a 3-story building or something. So it's, the kindest way to interpret it is that he had a poor memory, and that there was also no home run on his fatal last game. He hit 4 doubles. So, it's you have to take it with a boulder of salt, that story.
But it seems to me that based on what you've described and the history thus far, right, that's understood is that this was essentially a buildup and exacerbated by just an extraordinary workload of a heretofore unorthodox manner of delivering the ball over the plate, plus a full load of cricket work too, right?
Yeah, which actually would have involved fewer pitches than a baseball game, but
ironically,
yes. But in a way, this is the easiest part of the story to understand, because we see what baseball does to pitchers, right? When Dwight Gooden was a rookie, we knew they were overworking him. He threw over 300 innings, I believe. We knew they were overworking him, but how do you not overwork someone that's that good?
Yeah, and needed and valuable, especially come playoff time when you don't even get those 5 days of rest windows.
Exactly. So the difference between Creighton and him is that, medicine was not nearly as advanced, and his life was actually being risked. Now, you can cut them some slack because what Creighton was doing was entirely new, but it's hard not to believe from their actions and their statements that they felt guilty afterward, and they felt like they had a lot of responsibility for his death.
All right, here's my last sort of question here, and then I'll let you, obviously cul-de-sac and promote the book, of course, and stuff. But you're mentioning that the health implications and the comparisons today. There was consternation, though, about this story, right? Regardless of how specifically or acutely he succumbed, there was enough of a story that he died playing the game of baseball, right? And I suspect that there were a lot of people there who, especially with this game maybe turning the corner into a professional endeavor, that didn't want that story out there.
Absolutely. That's why they were eager to blame it on cricket. So yeah, the rivalry between baseball and cricket immediately comes to the fore there. And it's a little disturbing because I think it was I think it was, a intentional lie. But baseball probably felt that, killing their first national star, who was such a valuable thing in terms of marketing the sport, the subject of the first baseball card, the first recruited athlete, the first great pitcher, the reason for the strike zone, a guy who was entirely dominant, who helped make the game national. All those things. It's hard to imagine someone who could be more important to any sport than Jim Creighton was at that time. They don't want to be blamed for his death. That would be a disaster. But I think they intentionally muddied the waters a little.
All right. So that leads me to the last question that I have, right? And you probably see this one coming from third base down the home plate. Why is he not more well-known and in the Baseball Hall of Fame for, I mean, you've convinced me, and I'm just, I'm just the average fan, right? But it's clear that this is a guy who had significant influence in the trajectory, I can't even say the word today, it's been a long day, trajectory of the game, as well as being kind of the personification of the pivot from amateurism to professionalism. I can't imagine you wouldn't want to have a player / influencer like this be more solidly remembered and or revered.
Well, to me, I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think it's weird and crazy that he's not in the Hall of Fame because he's important to the game in a way that no one else was, and it's hard to imagine anyone else could be. So, if he was remembered as the inventor of modern pitching and the first great national star, and one of the reasons that baseball became the national pastime, maybe he'd be in the Hall of Fame. But, the answer to why he isn't, there's a lot of twists and turns to that, but it gets back to the thing we were talking about at the beginning that, okay, he never played Major League Baseball. And there are people in the Hall of Fame that didn't play, that didn't have significant Major League careers that are sort of shoehorned in because they were so important. People like George Wright or Henry Chadwick. But, this gets at another question, which is the arbitrariness of Hall of Fame standards, which change. Bill James wrote a whole book about it. The standards of how you got in, who got in, what the criteria were, are constantly being adjusted and changed. And they really don't, there's no consistent principle of what you do to be judged to be a Hall of Famer. So it's a combination of, and I think it's another issue is that people didn't really understand some of the basic facts about Creighton. They didn't understand what he was doing. They misunderstood what he was doing. Because he died so young, for instance, Candy Cummings is considered the inventor of the curveball, and he's in the Hall of Fame. He didn't have a great major league career. He pitched in the amateur era and then a few years in the National League. But he's not in for that. He's in for inventing the curveball. And when you read, the actual details of how that came to be, a lot of it has to do was that he was a popular guy who was around at the time. He had a long life and he was involved in organized baseball. There's a lot of weird arbitrariness to it. But, if arguments about who should be in the Hall of Fame, I guess the rational way to start them would be, what are your criteria? If it were me, one of my criteria would be that he had a massive positive effect on the game. So I would put Creighton in on that basis. Major League Baseball has never really been that interested in what happened before it. And Major League Baseball is the most influential, force in this whole question. Although I did find one very interesting artifact when I was researching my book, and it was a letter written in the early 30s by a guy named Alexander Cleland, who worked for the Clarks in Cooperstown. It was his idea to approach Major League Baseball and create the Hall of Fame. So the letter is the first proposal, what this would be and how it could help Cooperstown and how it could help Major League Baseball to have an institution like this. And in one of the early paragraphs, he says, well, we'll start out by honoring the greats of the early game, people like Creighton. I mean, that's pretty ironic that he's one of the first names mentioned by the guy who thought of the Hall of Fame.
Almost de facto, like, of course, somebody like.
Of course, you'd have him in it. Yeah. And then later, when there's this messy process of deciding who you're going to put in and who the people from what was then, even then, ancient history you're going to put in. the people making the judgments are Kennesaw Mountain Landis and 2 league presidents. I mean, there's not even like competent baseball journalists making the decision. So I feel like, Creighton's important, whether he's in the Hall of Fame or not. But I think it's kind of shocking and amazing that he's not.
Is there any world that you see where the case could be renewed or rethought? Is this book and your previous book part of that dynamic, for example?
I would love it if it would become that. There have been people who baseball has sort of on 3rd or 4th rethinking decided to put in. I can mention some names, but the door is never permanently shut to someone like Creighton. And who knows? I mean, if enough people read my book, maybe it'll get some momentum going. I think it's possible. I wouldn't bet on it, but I think it's possible.
Well, it also doesn't seem like it's a crazy theory, right? I mean, I think it's just for those who know and have taken the time to do the research like yourself and or understand sort of the evolution of things and understand the role of cricket in this country prior to the evolution of baseball and the other sort of hard work of kind of understanding really how all this sort of evolved, right? It's not coming out of. I mean, it's not like a science fiction story,
right? And if you just take a couple of his many firsts, right? Throwing the first curveball got Candy Cummings in, and Candy Cummings did not throw the first curveball. That was a mistake. But they put him in on that basis. And, being the ultimate reason for the strike zone, which is, I mean, how important is the strike zone in baseball? If you compare it to what Babe Ruth did to change the game, there are types of baseball that are not home run reliant. I mean, if you watch the Astros when they were playing in the Astrodome, you couldn't hit a home run in there. You can still play baseball, but it's really difficult to imagine baseball without the strike zone. And it's not just a technical argument. I mean, the strike zone is what we're watching when we're watching television, right? When you watch a baseball game on TV, you're looking at the battle over who controls the strike zone. That's what the game is about. And without Creighton, it may not have ever happened.
All right. Many thanks to Tom. As I say often, but I mean it this time for sure. Boy, did I learn a lot. And there is such an early if you will, mortal ooze of history that baseball has to offer that Tom, I think, has found a specialty in. And clearly his previous book has been well regarded by baseball historians and sports fans overall. How Baseball Happened, Outrageous Lies Exposed, The True Story Revealed, which came out in 2020. The paperback came out in 2022. That book is available wherever you get good books, or find the convenient links in the show description or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and you'll find those links there as well to our referral pals at Amazon, who gives us a couple of shekels of love when you purchase through those links, and we appreciate that. But we want to promote the heck out of the new book that's coming out in a couple of weeks. We want to get that algorithm favorably juiced, shall we say, in Tom's favor. And that book comes out, I believe, on March 24th. Don't hold me to that, of 2026. So if you're listening to the show prior to that, pre-order it now through the same links that we're going to give you there in the show description as well to Amazon. And if it's after the 24th, well, you have truly no reason not to do so. And that book, again, is called Death in the Strike Zone, The Mystery of America's First Baseball Hero. And again, that is the story of Jim Creighton, who we talked about at length in today's extravaganza. It's got to be as fascinating a story as Tom's previous one, and I'm sure it's going to be equally well received. And for you persistent listeners out there, we've got a couple of copies to give away, courtesy of the publisher of both of these books. We're going to give a copy away of the new book, Death in the Strike Zone, courtesy of, is it Godine or Godine Publishing? They're a small little house up in Boston, Massachusetts. Sorry. It's all that snow. I got confused with Buffalo. I can imagine. But I digress. No, they're in the Boston area. I can assure you that. And they've been kind enough to offer us a couple of copies, and I think we'll put the number at 3 3 to give away. And here's the trivia question. All you got to do is be one of the first 3 correct answers to the question. Send it to our email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We timestamp them so we know when they come in. And the question is this, pretty easy. Aside from the Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers, just give me the name of one professional baseball team. It could be semi-pro, it could be Major League Baseball, it could be Negro League Baseball. Give me the name of a Brooklyn team, not the Dodgers, that had the name Brooklyn in them. Pretty easy, especially if you're an historian or you grew up in the New York area. You probably know some of these names. And it could be, by the way, one of the names that the Dodgers were before they became the Dodgers. Doesn't matter to me. I just want one professional or semi-pro or Negro League team name with Brooklyn in it that wasn't the Dodgers. Just send that to me at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Be one of the first 3 to answer that correctly, and you will get a copy of this book. And again, thank you, courtesy of Godine or Godine Press up in Boston. However you say it, we cannot appreciate it enough. Thank you, of course, for listening. If you'd like to send us some email regularly, then that email address is just as good too, hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. It's where we post all of our episodes, and you can check everything out there. We've got all of our merch there and stuff, all kinds of fun and frivolity for you when you go there. You can check out Tom's website, why don't you? He's at howbaseballhappened.com. It's all one word, howbaseballhappened.com. You can follow us on socials as well. You'll find us probably most actively on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find us on the X Twitter thing at goodseatsstill. And then you'll find us just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including, by the way, YouTube, where we post and stream all of our episodes as well. So if you truly like to listen to and consume the show in that manner, by all means, do so there. And however you ingest the proceedings, we appreciate it. Thank you as we keep doling out appreciation to our pal Jerry Payne down in Atlanta. We appreciate his audio excellence once again this week. And of course, we appreciate your listening. Thank you tremendously, and we'll see you next week.